The old city bus wheezed to a stop outside Whitmore Concert Hall, its doors opening with a tired hiss. Margaret Chen stepped down carefully, clutching a small purse that had seen better days. The evening air was crisp, and she pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders as she looked up at the grand building before her. The concert hall stood like a palace made of golden stone, with tall columns and fancy carvings that caught the light from hundreds of glowing lamps. People in expensive clothes walked up the marble steps. Women in silk dresses that probably cost more than Margaret made in 3 months. Men in perfectly pressed suits with shoes that gleamed like mirrors. Margaret felt her stomach flutter with nerves. She didn't belong here, and everyone seemed to know it. As she joined the crowd moving toward the entrance, she caught glimpses of herself reflected in the glass doors. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, held with bobby pins that didn't quite match. Her black dress was clean but faded, the kind you might find at a thrift store. Her shoes were comfortable flats with scuff marks that no amount of polishing could hide. The ticket in her hand felt heavy, though it weighed nothing at all. It was printed on thick, cream-colored paper with gold lettering that announced tonight's performance. She had read it so many times that she knew every word by heart. This wasn't something she had bought for herself. Margaret could never afford a ticket that cost $200. It had come to her in the strangest way, part of an inheritance she never expected. As she approached the entrance, a man in a fancy uniform looked her up and down with barely hidden surprise. His eyebrows rose slightly as he took her ticket, scanning it twice as if he couldn't believe it was real. Behind her, she heard whispered conversations. "Did you see that woman? What is she doing here? Maybe she's lost. This isn't the kind of place for people like that. Someone should probably tell her this isn't a community center. Concert?" Margaret's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. The lobby was even more magnificent than the outside. A ceiling painted with angels and clouds, crystal chandeliers that threw rainbow patterns on the walls, and a grand staircase that curved like something from a fairy tale. Everywhere she looked, there were people who clearly belonged in this world of wealth and culture. A woman in a sparkling blue gown stood near the coat check, talking loudly to her friends. "I simply cannot wait to hear Victor Steinberg play tonight. They say he's the finest pianist of our generation. I flew in from Paris just for this performance." Another woman nodded eagerly. "Darling, I've heard him play in Vienna, absolutely divine. Of course, tickets were impossible to get. I had to use my connections just to secure our seats." Margaret found herself studying the other concert-goers, watching how they moved with easy confidence through this world that felt so foreign to her. They air-kissed friends, laughed at private jokes, and spoke casually about travels to places she had only seen in magazines. Their jewelry caught the light, their perfume created an invisible cloud of expensive scents, and their conversations flowed with the kind of cultural references that come from a lifetime of education and privilege. She made her way slowly through the crowd, following signs that would lead her to her seat. The corridors were lined with portraits of famous musicians and composers, their painted eyes seeming to watch her as she passed. Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin. Names she knew well, though she wondered if anyone here would believe that. An usher, in a crisp white shirt and black vest, checked her ticket again, his professional smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Section A, row 12, seat 15, he announced, then paused. That's quite close to the stage. Are you sure this is your ticket?" "Yes," Margaret said quietly. "It was my grandmother's." The usher's expression softened slightly, though confusion remained. He led her down a carpeted aisle toward seats that were clearly among the most expensive in the house. Around her, other patrons were settling in, opening programs and adjusting their designer glasses to read the small print. Margaret's seat was perfect, close enough to see every detail of the grand piano that sat like a sleeping giant in the center of the stage. The instrument was beautiful, its black surface so polished that it reflected the stage lights like a dark mirror. She had dreamed of sitting this close to such a magnificent piano, though she had never imagined it would happen. As she sat down, the woman next to her, elegant in pearls and a wine-colored dress, glanced over with poorly concealed curiosity. The look wasn't mean exactly, but it was the kind of stare you give to something unexpected, like finding a wildflower growing in a formal garden. Margaret opened her small purse and pulled out the program she had been given at the door. The cover featured a photo of Victor Steinberg, a distinguished man with silver hair and intense eyes, seated at a piano very much like the one on stage. Inside, there were pages about his career, his awards, his recordings that had topped classical music charts around the world. She read about tonight's program, pieces by Rachmaninoff, Chopin, and Liszt that would showcase the pianist's technical brilliance and emotional depth. These were names and compositions that stirred something deep in her chest, memories of hours spent in a small apartment where music had once filled every corner. The lights began to dim, and conversations gradually faded to whispers, then to silence. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and waited, feeling the anticipation build around her like electricity before a storm. In a few minutes, she would hear music performed at a level she had only dreamed of experiencing. But for now, she simply sat in her unexpected seat, surrounded by a world that didn't quite know what to make of her, holding onto a ticket that had brought her to this moment in ways she was still trying to understand. The ghosts of old melodies stirred in her memory, and for just a moment her fingers moved slightly against her purse, as if they remembered the weight and feel of piano keys beneath them. The curtain was about to rise, and Margaret Chen was about to experience an evening that would change everything, though she had no way of knowing just how dramatically her own life was about to transform. The memory came flooding back as Margaret sat waiting for the concert to begin. She was 7 years old again, standing on a wooden crate in her grandmother's tiny apartment, her small fingers barely able to reach the keys of an old upright piano that had somehow found its way into their cramped living space. "Posture, little dove," her grandmother Elena had said in her gentle accent, placing a hand on Margaret's back. "The music flows through your spine like water through a stream. Straight, but not stiff." Elena Volkov had been different from other grandmothers in their neighborhood. While other children's grandmothers taught them how to bake cookies or knit scarves, Elena taught Margaret something far more precious: the language of music that transcended words, borders, and social classes. The apartment they shared was small and simple. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture was second-hand, and the refrigerator made strange humming sounds that Elena claimed were just its way of singing along to their practice sessions. But when Elena sat at that old piano, the tiny space transformed into something magical. "In Russia, when I was young like you," Elena would tell her during their daily lessons, "I played in great halls with golden ceilings and audiences dressed in their finest clothes. But you know what I learned? The music doesn't care about golden ceilings or fancy dresses. Music only cares that you mean what you play." Margaret learned that her grandmother had been someone important once, a concert pianist who had performed across Europe before the world changed and forced her to leave everything behind. Elena never spoke about why she had to leave Russia, but sometimes when she played certain pieces, tears would gather in her eyes, and Margaret understood that some stories were too heavy for words. Every day after school, Margaret would run up the 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, her book bag bouncing on her back, eager to begin their lesson. Elena would already be waiting, having prepared tea in glasses with metal holders, just like they did back in her homeland. "Today we learned something new," Elena would announce, and Margaret's heart would race with excitement. Elena taught her not just how to read music, but how to feel it. She explained how each composer had their own voice. Chopin was like poetry, Bach was like mathematics made beautiful, and Rachmaninoff was like having your heart broken and healed at the same time. The old piano wasn't in perfect condition. Some keys stuck, others made tiny pinging sounds, and it needed to be tuned more often than they could afford. But Elena worked magic with that instrument, and gradually Margaret began to work magic too. "You have gift," Elena would say, when Margaret mastered a particularly difficult piece. "But gift is like seed, means nothing unless you plant it and tend it every day." Margaret's parents worked long hours at jobs that barely paid enough to keep them afloat. Her father cleaned office buildings at night. Her mother worked at a factory that made cleaning supplies. They were proud of Margaret's musical ability, But they also understood that lessons with real teachers and good instruments cost money they simply didn't have. "Elena is teaching you something precious," her mother would say when Margaret complained about practicing. "Don't waste this chance." As Margaret grew older, the lessons became more advanced. Elena taught her pieces that professional pianists struggled with. Complex works by Liszt that required fingers to fly across keys like hummingbirds, gentle nocturnes by Chopin that could make listeners forget their troubles, and powerful concertos that seemed to contain entire storms within their notes. But they both knew that Margaret's talent was trapped in their small world. Elena was too old and too poor to help Margaret find the opportunities she deserved. There were no connections to music schools, no money for auditions, no way to bridge the gap between Margaret's gift and the world where such gifts were recognized and celebrated. When Margaret turned 18, reality forced its way into their musical bubble. College was too expensive, and music school might as well have been on another planet. Margaret found work as a cleaner, just like her parents, and the daily lessons became weekly, then monthly, then rare treats squeezed between exhausting shifts and sleep. Elena never complained, never made Margaret feel guilty for having less time for music. But sometimes Margaret would catch her grandmother sitting at the piano alone, playing pieces they had worked on together, and the sadness in the old woman's eyes was almost too much to bear. "Promise me something," Elena had said during one of their last lessons together. Margaret was 35 by then, married to a kind man who worked construction, struggling to pay rent on their own small apartment. "Promise me you won't forget who you are when you sit at piano. Promise me music will always live in your heart, even when life tries to convince you it doesn't matter." Margaret had promised, though she wondered how she could keep such a promise. When pianos seemed to be disappearing from her life one day at a time, Elena's apartment piano was sold when Elena could no longer afford the rent. Margaret's own dreams of owning an instrument faded as bills piled up and practical concerns took over. When Elena died 5 years ago, Margaret felt like she had lost, not just her grandmother, but also the part of herself that believed in beauty and possibility. The funeral cost more than they had, and selling Elena's few possessions barely covered the expenses. Among those possessions was Elena's collection of sheet music, hundreds of pieces carefully preserved in folders and boxes, each one marked with Elena's penciled notes about tempo, feeling, and technique. Margaret kept all the music, even though she no longer had a piano to play it on. She also kept Elena's simple jewelry, a modest wedding ring, a pair of earrings, and a small locket that Elena had worn every day for as long as Margaret could remember. "This locket," Elena had said near the end, pressing it into Margaret's hands with fingers that shook slightly. "It carries more than you know. When you are ready, you will understand." Margaret had nodded, not really understanding what Elena meant, but treasuring the locket because it smelled like Elena's perfume, and seemed to hold warmth even when it should have been cold. Now sitting in the concert hall, Margaret touched the locket through her dress. Elena would have loved this place, would have belonged in it in ways that Margaret never could. But Elena was gone, and Margaret was here alone, carrying music in her heart that no one would ever hear, holding memories of lessons that had shaped her soul even though they had never changed her circumstances. The stage lights were brightening, and Margaret could hear the murmur of excitement from the audience around her. Soon they would all hear the kind of music Elena had once created, performed by someone who had been given every opportunity Margaret had been denied. But Elena's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, as real as if the old woman were sitting beside her. "Music doesn't care about opportunities, little dove. Music only cares that you mean what you play." The first half of the concert had been magical. Victor Steinberg had performed with the kind of skill that made the piano seem like an extension of his very soul. His fingers danced across the keys with precision that seemed almost impossible, drawing sounds from the instrument that Margaret had only dreamed of hearing live. During intermission, the audience buzzed with excitement. Margaret remained in her seat, watching elegant couples stroll toward the lobby for champagne and conversation. She opened her small purse and pulled out a piece of hard candy, her version of intermission refreshment, and allowed herself to fully absorb what she had just experienced. "Absolutely magnificent," declared the woman in pearls sitting beside her, speaking to her companion. "Steinberg has outdone himself tonight. I've never heard Rachmaninoff's Third played with such passion. Margaret nodded slightly. Though she knew the woman wasn't really speaking to her, she understood exactly what the woman meant. There had been moments during the first half when Steinberg's playing had transported her back to Elena's apartment, back to afternoons when music filled every corner of their small world. The lobby gradually emptied as people returned to their seats for the second half. Margaret checked her program again. Steinberg would be performing Chopin's ballads and finishing with Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, pieces that Elena had played for her countless times, though never with the technical perfection they were about to witness. But something was wrong. The scheduled start time came and went. Murmurs began to ripple through the audience as minutes ticked by without any sign of the pianist's return. Margaret noticed members of the concert hall staff having hushed, urgent conversations near the stage. Suddenly there was commotion backstage. Through a gap in the curtains, Margaret could see people moving quickly, their voices raised in concern. A woman in an evening gown hurried past, speaking rapidly into a cell phone. A man in a tuxedo appeared to be giving directions to someone. Margaret couldn't see. The audience grew restless. People began checking their watches and phones, craning their necks to see if they could glimpse what was happening behind the curtains. The excited chatter that had filled the air during intermission was replaced by confusion and growing concern. Then, Charles Whitmore III, the venue manager, appeared on stage. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s, with silver hair perfectly styled, and a formal evening coat that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. His usual confident demeanor seemed shaken as he approached the microphone at center stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the excellent acoustics of the hall, "I regret to inform you that Mr. Steinberg has suffered a medical emergency and will be unable to complete tonight's performance." The audience erupted. Gasps of concern mixed with complaints about ruined evening plans. Someone called out, "Is he all right?" Others immediately began discussing refunds and rescheduled performances. Charles raised his hand for quiet. "Mr. Steinberg is receiving excellent medical care, and we have every reason to believe he will make a full recovery. However, this leaves us in an unprecedented situation." Margaret felt her heart sink, not just for the disappointed audience but for Steinberg himself. She knew what it meant for a musician to be unable to perform. It was every artist's nightmare. "The Whitmore Concert Hall has been serving this community for over 150 years, Charles continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Tonight's performance was not just a concert, it was a crucial fundraising event for our restoration project. These funds would ensure that future generations can experience the magic of live classical music in this historic venue." Margaret looked around and noticed that the audience was listening more carefully now. She could see people reconsidering their immediate impulse to demand refunds. "I know this is highly unusual," Charles said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair in a gesture that revealed his desperation. "But I'm going to ask something that has never been asked in the history of this institution." The hall fell completely silent. Even the whispered complaints stopped as everyone waited to hear what Charles would say next. "Is there anyone in tonight's audience with sufficient musical training who might be willing to attempt to salvage this evening? I understand this is an extraordinary request, but these are extraordinary circumstances." The silence that followed was so complete that Margaret could hear her own heartbeat. She looked around the hall, scanning the faces of people who clearly had enough money and cultural sophistication to attend such an event. Surely someone among them had musical training. Surely someone could step forward. But nobody moved. The audience sat frozen, as if Charles had asked someone to perform surgery rather than play piano. Margaret could see people looking at each other, shaking their heads slightly, communicating without words that this was far beyond anything they were prepared to do. Charles waited, his eyes scanning the audience hopefully. "Anyone at all? Even if you're not a professional performer, if you have training that might allow you to play even a few pieces?" The silence stretched on. Margaret could feel the collective discomfort of hundreds of people who were being asked to step outside their comfortable roles as audience members and become something they weren't prepared to be. A man in the front row called out, "Surely you have understudies, other pianists you can call?" Charles shook his head sadly. At this hour, on such short notice with Mr. Steinberg's caliber of repertoire, I'm afraid we've exhausted those possibilities. Margaret felt something stirring inside her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. It was the same sensation she used to get as a child when Elena would play a particularly beautiful passage, a mixture of longing and recognition, as if the music was calling to something deep inside her soul. She found herself thinking about Elena's words. Music doesn't care about golden ceilings or fancy dresses. Music only cares that you mean what you play. Her hands, folded in her lap, began to tingle slightly. Without conscious thought, her fingers started moving in patterns they remembered from decades of practice. Scales, arpeggios, the opening, measures of pieces that had once lived in her muscle memory. Charles was looking increasingly desperate. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand this is not what any of us expected tonight, but I'm asking you to consider that sometimes the most meaningful art comes from the most unexpected places. Margaret's heart was pounding now. Around her she could hear people beginning to gather their things, preparing to leave. The woman in pearls was whispering to her companion about calling a car service. Others were already standing, clearly deciding that the evening was over. The locket around Margaret's neck seemed to grow warm against her skin, as if Elena's presence was somehow reaching across the years to this moment. Margaret could almost hear her grandmother's voice. When music calls to you, little dove, you must answer, not because you have to, but because you get to. Charles made one final appeal. If there's anyone at all, who feels they might be able to help us salvage this evening, please know that this audience and this institution would be forever grateful. Margaret felt herself beginning to stand before her conscious mind had fully decided to do so. Her legs seemed to be moving on their own, driven by something deeper than thought or logic. Around her, people began to notice. The woman in pearls looked up at her with surprise. Other audience members turned to see who was responding to Charles's desperate plea. And Margaret Chen, who had spent her entire life being invisible, suddenly found herself the center of attention in one of the most prestigious concert halls in the city. For a moment, Margaret stood frozen in place, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the concert hall could hear it. The weight of hundreds of eyes settling on her felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. She could feel her cheeks burning with embarrassment, but something deeper than fear kept her on her feet. Charles Whitmore squinted through the stage lights, trying to see who had responded to his plea. Yes? Someone has volunteered? Margaret's voice caught in her throat. She cleared it quietly and tried again. I can play piano, she said, her words barely loud enough to reach the stage. A ripple of whispers spread through the audience. Like wildfire, Margaret caught fragments of conversations around her. Did that woman just say she can play? The one in the old dress? She can't be serious. This is ridiculous. We paid good money for a professional performance. Charles shielded his eyes with his hand, trying to get a better look at Margaret. Ma'am, could you speak a bit louder? And perhaps come forward so we can discuss this properly? Every instinct in Margaret's body screamed at her to sit back down, to pretend this moment had never happened, to disappear into the anonymity she had known her entire life. But Elena's locket seemed to pulse with warmth against her chest, and she found herself stepping into the aisle. The walk down toward the stage felt like the longest journey of her life. Her worn flat shoes made soft sounds against the carpeted aisle, a stark contrast to the clicking of expensive heels she had heard during intermission. As she passed each row, she could feel people turning to stare, could hear whispered comments that weren't quite soft enough to be hidden. "This is embarrassing," muttered a man in a perfectly tailored suit. "They're going to let some amateur destroy what's left of the evening." "Look at her clothes," whispered a woman wearing enough jewelry to pay Margaret's rent for a year. "This isn't a community center talent show. Someone should stop this before it becomes a complete disaster," added another voice. Margaret felt each comment like a small cut, but she kept walking. With every step, she could hear Elena's voice more clearly in her memory. "Courage, little dove. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's playing beautiful music while your heart is breaking with terror." Charles met her at the foot of the stage, his expression a mixture of desperate hope and polite skepticism. Up close, she could see the fine lines of stress around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested just how much pressure he was under. "I'm Charles Whitmore," he said quietly, extending his hand. "And you are?" "Margaret Chen," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "I work nights cleaning the Meridian office building downtown." She watched Charles's face carefully, seeing the exact moment when he processed not just her occupation, but what it meant about her background, her education, her place in the social hierarchy that filled this concert hall. "Ms. Chen," he said carefully, "I appreciate your willingness to help, but I need to be honest with you. The pieces Mr. Steinberg was scheduled to perform tonight are extremely challenging. They require years of professional training and practice. I'm not sure—" "I understand," Margaret said quietly, "but I can play them." Charles looked out at the restless audience, then back at Margaret. She could see him weighing his options, the certainty of a complete disaster if he sent everyone home against the possibility of an even worse disaster if he let an unknown amateur attempt to fill Victor Steinberg's shoes. "What pieces are you familiar with?" he asked, pulling out the evening's program. Margaret looked at the list she had memorized during intermission. "All of them," she said simply. Charles blinked in surprise. "All of them? You're familiar with Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor?" "Opus 23, Margaret confirmed. "And the Ballad No. 4 in F minor, Opus 52. Also the Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 in C-sharp minor." The specificity of her answer seemed to catch Charles off guard. These weren't pieces that casual piano students typically attempted. They were the kind of works that separated skilled amateurs from serious musicians. "Ms. Chen," he said slowly, "where did you study piano?" "With my grandmother," Margaret replied. "Elena Volkov." Charles's eyes widened slightly. Even he, despite his focus on venue management rather than musical history, recognized that name. "Elena Volkov, the Russian pianist who performed across Europe in the 1960s. Margaret nodded, surprised that he knew. "She was my teacher until she died 5 years ago." The conversation had taken on a different tone now. Charles was no longer looking at her with polite skepticism, but with growing curiosity. Around them, Margaret could hear the audience becoming increasingly impatient. "When did you last perform publicly?" Charles asked. "Never," Margaret admitted. "But I've played these pieces many times. Elena taught them to me." Charles ran a hand through his hair again, his careful composure beginning to slip. "Ms. Chen, I need you to understand something. This audience paid substantial amounts of money to hear world-class performance. If you attempt this and it doesn't go well—" "I understand," Margaret said. "But what if it does go well?" From the audience, someone called out impatiently, "Are we going to have a concert or not? Some of us have other commitments tonight." Charles looked back at Margaret, studying her face as if trying to read her soul. "You really believe you can do this?" Margaret thought about Elena's hands guiding hers over piano keys, about afternoons spent perfecting difficult passages until they became as natural as breathing, about musical phrases that lived so deeply in her memory that they felt like part of her heartbeat. "Yes," she said quietly, "I can do this." Charles glanced once more at the audience, then made a decision that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced into the microphone, "we have a volunteer pianist who will attempt to continue tonight's program. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Margaret Chen." The applause that followed was polite but unenthusiastic, the kind of response an audience gives when they're not sure what else to do. Margaret could hear undertones of skepticism, impatience, and resignation. People were clearly prepared to endure rather than enjoy whatever was about to happen. As Charles led her toward the stage steps, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in the black surface of the grand piano. She looked exactly like what she was. A working-class woman in her 50s wearing a simple dress and carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned not to expect too much from life. But as she approached the piano bench, something began to change in her posture. Her shoulders straightened slightly, her breathing deepened, and her hands, those hands that had scrubbed floors and cleaned windows for decades, began to remember a different kind of work they had once done. Elena's voice seemed to whisper, "One final piece of advice. Don't play for them, little dove. Play for the music. Play for me. Play for the part of yourself that never forgot who you really are." Margaret sat down at the bench and adjusted it to the right height. Her movements, precise and confident in a way that surprised even her. She looked out at the sea of skeptical faces, then down at the keys that gleamed like black and white teeth in the stage lights. The concert hall fell silent, waiting to see what this unexpected pianist would do with their expensive evening. And Margaret Chen, who had spent her life being overlooked and underestimated, placed her hands on the keys and prepared to remind everyone, including herself, that true artistry doesn't always come from the places we expect to find it. Margaret's hands hovered over the keys for what felt like an eternity. The silence in the concert hall was so complete she could hear the soft hum of the stage lights above her head. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from fear but from the electricity of touching a piano this magnificent after 5 years of silence. The instrument beneath her hands was a Steinway concert grand, worth more than most people's houses. Its keys were perfectly weighted, responsive to the slightest touch, and the sound it produced would carry every nuance of emotion to the farthest corners of the hall. It was the kind of piano Elena had once played, the kind Margaret had only dreamed of experiencing. She could feel the audience behind her, their skepticism hanging in the air like a heavy curtain. Someone coughed. Another person shifted uncomfortably in their seat. She heard a whispered conversation near the back. "How long are we supposed to wait? This is getting ridiculous." Charles Whitmore stood in the wings, his face pale with anxiety. He had made a desperate decision, and now the reputation of his family's concert hall rested in the hands of a woman he had met 5 minutes ago. Margaret could sense his nervous energy even without looking at him. She closed her eyes and tried to find Elena in her memory. "What would you tell me right now, Grandmama?" she whispered to herself. The answer came immediately in Elena's gentle, accented voice. "Begin with truth, little dove. Begin with the first thing that made your heart sing." Margaret's fingers found their position, and she began with something simple, a scale in C major, the very first thing Elena had ever taught her. Her touch was tentative at first, reacquainting herself with the feel of keys beneath her fingertips. The notes rang out clear and pure, each one perfectly placed. But a simple scale wasn't going to satisfy this audience. She could feel their impatience growing, could hear someone near the front mumbling about amateur hour. Margaret knew she had perhaps 30 seconds to prove she belonged on this stage, or the evening would collapse into embarrassment for everyone involved. She transitioned from the scale into something more complex, a series of arpeggios that climbed and descended like musical waterfalls. Her fingers began to remember their old flexibility, muscle memory awakening after years of dormancy. The arpeggios flowed faster, more confidently, building into cascades of notes that demonstrated technical skill beyond what anyone in the audience had expected. A subtle shift occurred in the hall's atmosphere. The restless rustling of programs and purses grew quieter. People were beginning to listen rather than simply endure. Margaret opened her eyes and looked down at her hands as they moved across the keys. These hands that had scrubbed floors and wiped down office windows were creating sounds of stunning beauty. It felt like meeting an old friend after a long separation, surprising, emotional, and perfectly natural all at once. But she wasn't here to play scales and exercises. The audience had paid to hear Chopin, Liszt, and the masters of Romantic piano literature. Margaret took a deep breath and launched into the opening measures of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. The piece began gently, almost conversationally, as if the piano were telling a story to an intimate friend. Margaret's touch was perfect, soft enough to draw listeners in, but with enough clarity that every note spoke distinctly. The melody lines sang out above a delicate accompaniment, and for the first time since she had stood up in the audience, Margaret felt completely at home. Elena had taught her this piece when she was 16, spending months perfecting not just the notes but the emotional narrative that held them together. "Chopin is telling you about love," Elena had explained during those long-ago lessons. First, the gentle beginning of affection, then the passion, then the storms that lovers face, and finally, well, you'll understand when you're older. Now, at 52, Margaret understood completely. Her interpretation of the piece carried decades of lived experience, the quiet joys of simple love, the frustrations of dreams deferred, the acceptance that comes with age. The music poured out of her with an emotional honesty that no amount of technical training could manufacture. The audience was listening now, really listening. The shuffling and whispering had stopped completely. Even the skeptics were being drawn into the spell Margaret was weaving with Elena's old lessons and her own hard-won wisdom about life. As the piece built toward its more dramatic sections, Margaret's playing grew bolder. Her left hand provided a rich, rolling foundation while her right hand sang the melody with increasing intensity. The difficult passages that had once required hours of practice flowed from her fingers as if she had played them yesterday instead of years ago. The woman in pearls who had been sitting next to Margaret was leaning forward in her seat, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by genuine amazement. Around the hall, people were having similar reactions, surprise giving way to appreciation, skepticism melting into admiration. Charles Whitmore, watching from the wings, felt his anxiety transform into something approaching awe. This wasn't just competent piano playing. This was artistry. Margaret was taking Chopin's notes and infusing them with something personal and profound, creating the kind of performance that reminded people why they loved live music in the first place. But Margaret herself was barely aware of the audience's reaction. She was lost in the music, reconnecting with a part of herself she had thought was gone forever. Her fingers found their way through passages she hadn't played in years, guided by muscle memory and heart memory that proved stronger than time. As she approached the ballad's dramatic climax, her playing grew more powerful. The piano responded to her touch like a living thing, producing sounds that filled every corner of the concert hall. The emotional intensity of the music built toward its inevitable conclusion, carrying the audience along on a journey they had never expected to take. When the final notes faded into silence, Margaret kept her hands on the keys for a moment, barely breathing. She had forgotten how it felt to be completely absorbed in music, to disappear into melodies and emerge on the other side feeling like she had traveled to another world. The silence that followed was different from the skeptical quiet that had greeted her arrival on stage. This was the profound hush that follows genuine artistic achievement, the moment when an audience needs time to process what they have just experienced. Then, slowly, tentatively, applause began. It started with one person, then another, then spread through the hall like ripples on a pond. The woman in pearls was clapping enthusiastically, her face bright with surprise and delight. Other audience members joined in, their applause growing warmer and more sustained than the polite reception Margaret had received when she first sat down. Margaret looked out at the faces in the audience and saw something she had never seen before. People looking at her with respect, with appreciation, with the kind of recognition usually reserved for professional artists. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. But this was only the beginning. She still had more pieces to play, more opportunities to prove that the magic of those first few minutes hadn't been a fluke. Elena's voice whispered encouragement. In her memory, "Beautiful start, little dove, now show them what else you can do." As the applause for the Chopin ballade faded, Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her. The nervous, apologetic woman who had walked down the aisle 10 minutes ago was disappearing, replaced by someone she hadn't been in years, musician. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic, it was like watching the sun rise, gradual but undeniable. She adjusted her posture at the piano bench, her movements now carrying the confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing deepened, and when she placed her hands back on the keys, it was with the assurance of an artist claiming her rightful place. The next piece on the program was Chopin's Ballade No. 4 in F minor, a work that Elena had called the Mount Everest of piano literature. It was longer and more complex than the first ballad, requiring not just technical skill but the kind of emotional maturity that came from truly understanding life's complexities. Margaret, began the piece with its deceptively simple opening theme, a melody so beautiful it seemed to float in the air like a prayer. But underneath that surface simplicity lay layers of harmonic sophistication that would challenge even the most accomplished pianists. As she played, Margaret felt Elena's presence so strongly, it was as if her grandmother were sitting beside her on the bench. "This piece is about memory," Elena had told her during their lessons. "About how the past lives inside us, sometimes beautiful, sometimes painful, but always present." Now, as Margaret's fingers found their way through the intricate variations, she understood what Elena had meant. The music seemed to contain her entire life. The dreams of childhood, the compromises of adulthood, the wisdom that came from accepting both joy and sorrow. The audience was completely absorbed now. The skepticism that had greeted Margaret's arrival had been replaced by something approaching reverence. People who had initially questioned her presence were now leaning forward in their seats, caught up in the emotional journey her playing was creating. Charles Whitmore, watching from the wings, found himself taking mental notes. He had been managing this concert hall for 15 years, had hosted world-renowned artists and witnessed countless performances. But there was something different about what was happening tonight. Margaret wasn't just playing the notes correctly. She was breathing life into them, making them speak in a way that connected directly to the hearts of everyone listening. As the piece progressed through its various sections, Margaret's playing grew more confident and expressive. She was no longer simply remembering Elena's lessons. She was making the music her own, bringing to it all the experiences and emotions that had shaped her life since those lessons ended. The technical demands of the piece would have intimidated many professional pianists, but Margaret met each challenge with increasing assurance. Her fingers navigated the rapid scales and complex passages with precision, while her musical phrasing revealed a deep understanding of Chopin's romantic sensibilities. In the audience, people were having their own emotional reactions to the music. The woman in pearls found herself thinking about her own grandmother, long deceased, who had tried to teach her piano before practical concerns took over. A businessman in the third row was remembering the music lessons he had abandoned in favor of more practical pursuits. All around the hall, Margaret's playing was awakening memories and emotions that many had forgotten they possessed. But it was Margaret herself who was experiencing the most profound transformation. With each phrase, each perfectly executed passage, she was rediscovering not just her musical abilities but her identity as an artist. The years of doubt and suppressed dreams were falling away like old clothing, revealing someone she had always been but had forgotten how to be. When she reached the piece's climactic coda, a section that required her to play multiple melodic lines simultaneously while maintaining perfect clarity and emotional intensity, Margaret felt as if she were flying. Her hands moved across the keyboard with a freedom and confidence she had never experienced, even in her youth. The music poured out of her with such natural flow that it seemed like the piano was playing itself. The final notes of the ballade rang out with crystalline clarity, hanging in the air for a moment before fading into absolute silence. The emotional impact of the performance was so powerful that the audience seemed temporarily stunned, as if waking from a shared dream. Then the applause erupted. But this wasn't the polite acknowledgement Margaret had received after the first piece. This was genuine enthusiasm, the kind of response usually reserved for celebrated artists. People weren't just clapping, they were on their feet, their faces bright with amazement and gratitude. Margaret looked out at the standing ovation and felt tears gathering in her eyes. She thought about Elena, about all those afternoons spent practicing in their tiny apartment, about dreams that had seemed impossible for so long they had become forgotten. Elena had always insisted that Margaret had the soul of a true artist, but Margaret had never really believed it until this moment. As the applause continued, Margaret caught sight of Charles Whitmore in the wings. His expression had completely changed from the desperate anxiety she had seen earlier. Now he was applauding as enthusiastically as anyone in the audience, his face showing a mixture of relief, amazement, and professional appreciation for what he was witnessing. But Margaret knew the evening wasn't over yet. She still had one more piece to play, Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, a work that would test every aspect of her abilities. It was a piece that demanded not just technical virtuosity but showmanship, the kind of performance that could bring an audience to its feet in wild celebration. As the applause finally died down and people returned to their seats, Margaret felt a calm certainty settling over her. She was no longer the uncertain woman who had hesitantly volunteered to help save the evening. She was a pianist, an artist, someone with something important to share with the world. Elena's voice seemed to whisper one final piece of encouragement. Now show them fire, little dove. Show them passion. Show them why music matters. Margaret smiled, placed her hands on the keys, and prepared to play the performance of her lifetime. The transformation was complete. The janitor had become the show artist she had always been meant to be, and there was one more mountain left to climb. Margaret paused before beginning the final piece, her hands resting gently on the keys. Something was calling to her. Not the Liszt Rhapsody that was printed on the program, but something else entirely. Elena's locket seemed to pulse with warmth against her chest, and suddenly she remembered something her grandmother had said during one of their last conversations. Inside the piano bench, "Little dove," Elena had whispered, her voice already weakened by the illness that would soon claim her. "The concert grand pianos, the good ones, they have secret compartments. Look for the small keyhole usually hidden near the hinges." At the time, Margaret had assumed Elena was speaking from memories of her performing days, perhaps confused by medication. But now, sitting at this magnificent Steinway, she found herself looking more closely at the bench beneath her. The audience waited patiently, assuming she was taking a moment to prepare for the demanding Liszt piece. But Margaret was examining the piano bench with new eyes, running her fingers along its edges until she found what Elena had described, a tiny keyhole, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Her heart began racing as she reached for Elena's locket, the piece of jewelry she had worn every day since her grandmother's death. For 5 years she had treasured it simply as a memento, never understanding Elena's cryptic words about it carrying more than you know. With trembling fingers, Margaret opened the locket. Inside, nestled next to a tiny photograph of Elena as a young woman, was something she had never noticed before. A delicate key, so small she had always mistaken it for part of the locket's decoration. The key fit perfectly into the hidden lock. Margaret turned it with a soft click, and a section of the piano bench opened to reveal a small hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, were several sheets of handwritten music. The paper was yellowed with age, and the notes were written in Elena's distinctive handwriting. Margaret lifted the pages with reverent care, her eyes scanning the title written in Elena's elegant script. "For my granddaughter, the pianist, Elena Volkov, 1987. Below that, in smaller letters, a piece written in hope, to be played when the music in your heart can no longer be silent. Tears began flowing down Margaret's face as she realized what she was holding. This was Elena's final composition, a piece her grandmother had written specifically for her and hidden away, waiting for the day when Margaret would be ready to find it. The audience, sensing something significant was happening, remained respectfully quiet. Charles Whitmore, still watching from the wings, took a step closer, trying to understand what had caused this unexpected pause in the performance. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked out at the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the concert hall's excellent acoustics, "I've just discovered something extraordinary. This piano bench contains a composition written by my grandmother, Elena Volkov, specifically for this moment. With your permission, I would like to perform this piece instead of the scheduled Liszt." A murmur of excitement rippled through the audience. The name Elena Volkov was familiar to many of the classical music enthusiasts in attendance. She had been a respected performer in her day, though her career had been cut short by circumstances beyond her control. Margaret spread the handwritten pages on the piano's music stand, though she suspected she wouldn't need them. Elena had always insisted that the most important music lived in the heart, not on the page. As Margaret read through the opening measures, she could hear Elena's voice explaining the piece as if she were sitting right there beside her. "This piece tells the story of a seed," Elena seemed to whisper. "A seed planted in love, buried by circumstance but never forgotten. It tells about the day that seed finally finds light and grows into something beautiful." The composition began, softly, with a melody that seemed to emerge from silence like dawn breaking over a quiet landscape. Margaret's fingers found the notes instinctively, as if Elena had somehow planted them directly into her muscle memory years ago. The opening theme was gentle but persistent, speaking of patience, hope, and dreams that refused to die. As the piece developed, Margaret could see Elena's entire story unfolding in the music. There were passages that spoke of youth and promise, followed by darker sections that suggested loss and displacement. But running through it all was an unbreakable thread of melody that represented the power of music to survive any hardship. The audience was completely entranced. They were witnessing something unprecedented, the world premiere of a lost composition by a respected artist, performed by her granddaughter at the most emotionally charged moment of both their lives. The intimacy and significance of the moment was not lost on anyone in the hall. Margaret's playing grew more confident and expressive as the piece progressed. She could feel Elena guiding her through passages that told their shared story. The patient teaching, the interrupted lessons, the long years of silence, and now this moment of rediscovery and triumph. The composition built toward a climax that required everything Margaret had learned from Elena and everything she had experienced in the years since. Her technique was flawless, but more importantly, her emotional connection to the music was so profound that it seemed to transform the very air in the concert hall. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Margaret realized that Elena had written an ending that looked toward the future rather than dwelling on the past. The final pages spoke of new beginnings, of talents finally recognized, of music finding its way back into the world after long absence. The last measures were a conversation between the melody that had opened the piece and new themes that suggested infinite possibility. Margaret played them with tears streaming down her face, feeling Elena's presence so strongly that she could almost see her grandmother standing beside the piano, smiling with pride and love. When the final note faded into silence, the concert hall seemed to hold its breath. What they had just witnessed was more than a performance. It was a resurrection, a completion of something that had been waiting decades to be fulfilled. The silence stretched on for long moments, as if the audience needed time to process the extraordinary gift they had just received. Margaret sat with her hands still on the keys, feeling Elena's spirit surrounding her like an embrace, knowing that this moment was exactly what her grandmother had envisioned when she wrote those words. "For my granddaughter, the pianist." Then, from somewhere in the back of the hall, a single person began to applaud. Others joined in, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm, until the entire audience was on its feet, offering Margaret Chen the most thunderous ovation in the concert hall's long and distinguished history.